August 19, 1944, East Prussia. Inside the crumbling headquarters of the German High Command, a silence heavier than defeat filled the room. The map still showed the Reich stretching proudly across Europe, but every man staring at them knew the truth was dissolving faster than ink on wet paper. General Alfred Jodl leaned over the chart of Western France, his fingers trembling as he calculated what logic demanded must soon happen. Patton's army had advanced too far, too fast. The Americans were 400 miles from their supply base. No army in history could survive that distance. The war, by every mathematical law of warfare, should correct itself. The enemy would stall, the Third Reich would breathe again. But beyond those walls, thousands of engines were already roaring to life. A storm of headlights carved through the French night, endless convoys moving east. The Germans had never seen such defiance of physics, such madness of motion. It was not strategy. It was civilization in motion, industrial, relentless, unafraid of exhaustion. Soldiers who had once believed themselves the masters of modern warfare now faced something they could neither fight nor understand, a supply system that broke every rule they had written. To the men who had built the Blitzkrieg, this new form of war felt like blasphemy. The Americans didn't hide their convoys. They illuminated the night. They didn't conserve fuel. They burned oceans of it. They didn't fear chaos. They commanded it. And among the drivers, most were African-American soldiers, men the Reich considered subhuman, now carrying the lifeblood of the enemy army that would soon reach Berlin. Every mile they drove was a humiliation to Nazi ideology, every truck a nail in the coffin of the old world. What none of the German generals understood that night was that the war had already shifted. It was no longer about tanks or tactics. It was about speed, production, and the human will to keep moving when reason says stop. They thought the Americans would slow down. Instead, the Red Ball Express was about to erase the word impossible from modern war, and as the rumble of engines echoed across occupied France, a terrifying realization dawned on Germany's greatest minds. They were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting an idea, one that could not be bombed, stopped, or reasoned with. August 19th, 1944. The night smelled of fear and fuel. In East Prussia, behind walls hung with maps and fading portraits of past victories, the German High Command gathered in a silence that felt like the pause before execution. No one said it, but they all knew. The war was slipping through their fingers. It was no longer a question of winning, but of how long they could pretend not to be losing. Outside, the forests of Rastenburg were dark and damp, filled with echoes of engines in retreat. Inside, a single light flickered over General Alfred Jodl's desk as he ran his hand across a chart of Western Europe, tracing the line of Patton's advance with trembling precision. The pencil stopped near Paris. The Americans had advanced more than 400 miles from Normandy in just 30 days. That speed was an insult to every lesson German warfare had ever taught. Armies were not supposed to move that fast. Supply lines had rules written in fuel, iron, and exhaustion. Jodl believed in those rules. He had built a career on them. His voice was calm when he said, "They will stop soon. They must." The staff nodded, not because they believed him, but because belief was the last thing they could afford to lose. Across the table, General Westphal murmured something about logistics. Numbers covered his notes like a confession. 12,000 tons of supplies required each day, 1,000 trucks to move it, roads destroyed, bridges bombed, railways cut. Even if the Americans had a miracle in reserve, it couldn't last. The laws of war were immutable, he said, but the room felt heavier after every word, because everyone knew that lately. The laws of war seemed to obey someone else. For a moment, someone mentioned Stalingrad, a memory like a scar. They had once believed themselves invincible there, too. They had calculated, predicted, planned every kilometer, and yet the Russian winter had swallowed them whole. The generals knew how fragile logic became when the world changed faster than the mind could follow. And now, as the reports came in from France, they felt the same sensation again, that sickening drift between certainty and chaos. Only this time, it wasn't the cold that would kill them. It was speed. In the stillness, a junior officer entered with fresh intelligence. A convoy, he said, a massive one. Thousands of vehicles moving east through France. They ignored blackout orders, headlights shining through the night. trucks in endless columns, moving without pause. The officer's voice faltered as he read, "Movement observed at intervals of less than 1 minute. No spacing, no concealment." The older men exchanged glances of disbelief. Madness, they thought. No commander would risk such exposure. Not under the Luftwaffe, not under artillery. The Americans must be desperate or stupid. Either way, their collapse would be spectacular. But what the Germans couldn't yet grasp was that this wasn't desperation. It was transformation. The war they had designed no longer existed. The Blitzkrieg had been their creation, a doctrine of speed, coordination, and control. But what they were seeing now was something else entirely. The Americans were waging a kind of war that had no rhythm, no discipline by traditional standards. It was industrial chaos, organized by abundance, powered by machinery, and fed by faith in endless replacement. They weren't conserving, they were consuming, and consumption, to the German mind, felt like sin. One of the officers, a veteran of the Eastern Front, whispered almost to himself, "They are not fighting to survive, they are fighting to move." No one answered. The phrase hung in the air like prophecy. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere in the forests beyond the headquarters, the distant growl of an engine echoed. One of their own, perhaps, or an echo from another world already in motion. Jodl stared at the map again, at the line of the Seine, and thought of how much territory could vanish in a week. He had been taught that history belonged to those who calculated best, but now he began to wonder if history belonged to those who no longer cared about calculation. He tried to reassure himself. The Americans would stop. They would run out of fuel. They would lose their momentum. But in his gut, he felt the uneasy truth. The Americans had too much of everything. Too much steel, too much oil, too much optimism. And that optimism was deadlier than any weapon. It was the belief that limits were temporary. In a bunker hundreds of miles away, Field Marshal Walter Model read the same reports and came to the same conclusion, though he refused to admit it aloud. He underlined one phrase from an intercepted American message, "Keep them rolling." The simplicity infuriated him. No strategy, no sophistication, just movement, relentless and blind. He had once mocked American culture as mechanical and soulless. Now he realized that was its strength. Machines do not tire. Machines do not question orders. Machines only move forward. Meanwhile, the German soldiers in the field began to sense it before the generals did. They saw the endless columns of American vehicles filling the horizon. They heard the sound, a continuous thunder that never ceased, day or night. They started to call it the Iron Wind. The noise became psychological torment, an invisible front line that eroded willpower. Even when no Americans were visible, the sound followed them, through forests, across rivers, into their dreams. One captured German officer later said, "It was as if the earth itself had joined their army." The High Command tried to explain it scientifically. They studied fuel consumption, tire wear, and maintenance rates. They concluded that the Americans were violating the physical limits of supply, and yet every day new reports arrived. Patton advancing, divisions reinforced, artillery resupplied, cities falling. The mathematics no longer worked. The equations refused to hold. It was like watching gravity fail. Then came the most disturbing revelation of all. The drivers of these convoys, the lifeblood of the American advance, were not the white, disciplined soldiers the Nazis had been trained to respect. They were mostly African-American troops, men whom Nazi ideology had deemed inferior. And yet, these men were achieving what the Reich had declared impossible. Every mile they drove was a refutation of 1,000 pages of racist theory. In Berlin, propaganda officials debated whether to suppress or reinterpret the intelligence. How could they admit that their defeat was being delivered by the very people their ideology had sought to erase from history? The generals refused to believe it. They insisted the reports were exaggerated. But disbelief is a kind of surrender. Every hour they spent denying what was happening, the Red Ball Express rolled another 100 miles closer to Germany. By the end of that week, Jodl no longer spoke of victory. He spoke of containment, of holding the line, of surviving the inevitable. He still wore his medals, still signed orders with mechanical precision, but the conviction was gone. He had seen something that shattered the old world, a vision of war that no longer belonged to Europe, to aristocracy, or to hierarchy. The Americans were not merely fighting a battle. They were demonstrating a civilization's philosophy, movement as destiny. In the following days, the maps in the headquarters changed daily. Red arrows that once marked German offensives were now black lines of retreat. The front was not collapsing, it was dissolving. The generals stopped arguing over tactics. Instead, they began asking quieter questions. How do you fight an enemy that measures victory not in territory, but in speed? How do you defeat a nation that turns chaos into order, waste into strength, and failure into momentum? Outside, another convoy of trucks growled through the forest roads. The sound grew louder, nearer, until it seemed to vibrate. Through the walls of the command post, Jodl closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the roar from France, a sea of engines rolling east, a tide of civilization that no fortress could hold back. For the first time, he understood that the defeat of Germany was not just military, it was philosophical. They had lost not only the war of weapons, but the war of ideas. And as the dawn broke over East Prussia, washing the bunker in pale, uncertain light, the realization settled over the German high command like a curse. The Reich had been built on control, on precision, on order. But its enemies had learned something greater. They had learned how to make chaos obey. Jodl looked once more at the map, at the arrows of American advance stretching like veins through the heart of Europe, and whispered words that no one in the room dared repeat. "They are not advancing toward Berlin," he said. "They are advancing toward the future." The room fell silent. Somewhere far away, the engines kept rolling. The night had become their enemy. Every time darkness fell, German soldiers would hear the distant growl of engines that never stopped. It started as a faint vibration in the air, then grew into a low thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. To the men hiding in the ruins and forests of northern France, it sounded less like trucks and more like time itself, a force moving forward, indifferent, unstoppable. They called it the Iron Wind. Some whispered that it was not the Americans, but the future approaching, a storm of metal and willpower. And for those who had believed the German army was the most advanced in the world, that sound broke something inside them. German engineers and officers tried to explain it with logic. It was just a supply operation, they said, the so-called Red Ball Express. They told themselves it would collapse under its own weight. No system could sustain that speed, that volume, that recklessness. But as the nights went on, the trucks didn't stop. Columns of light stretched over the horizon. Thousands of vehicles moved without pause, headlights blazing in open defiance of every military principle the Germans had ever written. To them it was madness. To the Americans it was logistics. In every report, the same impossible details repeated. Convoys every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. Fuel delivered faster than it could be burned. Bridges repaired overnight. Roads rebuilt while the battle still raged. German officers studying the data began to feel a kind of vertigo. It was as if they were staring at a new species of war, one that didn't rely on discipline or tradition, but on the sheer ability to adapt faster than the world could destroy. The Red Ball Express was not an army. It was an idea in motion. What happens to a soldier trained to believe in precision when he faces an enemy who wins through chaos? The Germans were beginning to find out. They had built a military machine that valued order, obedience, and perfection. The Americans were winning with imperfection, with flexibility, noise, and risk. Every broken truck was simply replaced. Every lost driver was substituted. Every rule of warfare the Germans considered sacred was being ignored. And yet, the system worked. In the forests near Chartres, a captured German lieutenant watched a convoy roll past for an hour, without a single gap. Later, in interrogation, he said something no one forgot. "We realized then that we were not fighting men anymore. We were fighting production." He was right. Behind every American soldier stood an entire continent of factories, workers, and machines, and the Red Ball Express was their heartbeat. But there was another truth, one that shook the German worldview even deeper. The majority of those drivers, the men keeping Patton's army alive, were African American. In the ideology of the Reich, such men were supposed to be incapable of this kind of precision, coordination, and endurance. And yet here they were, driving through exhaustion and gunfire, keeping the enemy moving when logic said they should have stopped days ago. The German officers studying the reports couldn't comprehend it. It wasn't just a defeat in battle, it was a defeat of belief. Imagine for a moment the confusion, a world built on hierarchy and certainty suddenly facing one that thrives on contradiction. For the Germans, this was a psychological collapse as much as a military one. The trucks they heard at night weren't just carrying ammunition, they carried a new kind of civilization, one that treated abundance as strategy and improvisation as discipline. How do you fight a nation that never fears waste? How do you defeat soldiers who drive through the night with their headlights on, daring you to attack them? Somewhere near Reims, a German recon unit reported what seemed impossible. Convoys visible from 20 kilometers away, stretching endlessly into the distance. No attempt at concealment, no camouflage, just light, miles of it, cutting through the dark like defiance made visible. They expected the Luftwaffe to strike, but there were no planes left to send. Instead, they watched in silence as the Americans rewrote the rules of survival. Every kilometer the Red Ball Express advanced, German morale declined. Soldiers who had once marched proudly now stared at their own broken supply wagons and rusting vehicles. Understanding the scale of their disadvantage, the Reich had planned for efficiency. The Americans had planned for excess. Germany had built a perfect war machine. America had built a system that could afford to be imperfect and still win. Do you see the irony? The same industrial force the Germans had mocked as crude and soulless was now the very reason they could not breathe. Every night, that hum of engines reminded them that they were outnumbered not just in men or weapons, but in time itself. The Americans could afford mistakes, the Germans could not. And that difference was fatal. There is a kind of horror that comes when a person realizes they are no longer the master of their world. That was what the German High Command began to feel as they studied the logistics reports. They had believed that war belonged to the soldier, to courage, to will. But the Americans were proving something darker. That war now belonged to whoever could build faster, move faster, and replace faster. It was a war of momentum, not morality. As September approached, something strange began happening on the front. German troops started hearing phantom convoys, truck noises that didn't exist. The sound haunted them even when the Red Ball Express wasn't near. Psychologists later called it acoustic trauma, but at the time soldiers thought it was a curse. They would wake at night and swear they could hear the Americans coming. It was the sound of inevitability. Some German officers began keeping diaries again, not to record victories, but to understand the collapse of their own logic. One entry from a staff captain near Metz reads, "We are witnessing the end of the old world. They move without fear. They consume as they advance. It is as if we are fighting the embodiment of the future." His words, once buried in archives, sound eerily modern today. Because in truth, the Red Ball Express was not only about 1944, it was about everything that would come after. A world where progress is measured by how fast you can replace what breaks, and where power belongs to those who can keep moving when others stop. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Because even now in your own life, you see echoes of it every day. In the speed of technology that never slows down, in the pressure to produce more, to move faster, to replace rather than repair, in that constant hum of motion that makes it hard to rest. The same logic that defeated the German generals now defines the world we live in. It forces a question. Have we learned from it, or have we become it? The Red Ball Express proved that speed wins wars, but at what cost? Behind every roaring engine there was exhaustion, fear, and sacrifice. Behind every victory there was a life burned out to keep the system moving. It is easy to admire progress. It is harder to question what it takes to feed it. Before you go, let this story stay with you, because history is not only what happened, but what keeps happening. If this narrative has made you feel the pulse of that history, the heartbeat of those engines that changed the world, then don't let it fade. Click the red button in the corner of your screen. Join us as we continue to uncover the forgotten truths that shaped our present. Every story like this reminds us that progress has a price, and understanding it is the only way to make sure we never pay it blindly again. The air in Berlin had grown heavier by September 1944. The same men who had once shouted about destiny now whispered about delay, withdrawal, and survival. The reports coming in from the Western Front were no longer about victories or counter-offensives, but about something far more disturbing. something that challenged the very foundation of Nazi ideology. The Red Ball Express had not only defied German logistics, it had humiliated German belief. In the grand halls of command, officers read intelligence briefs in disbelief. The majority of the drivers supplying Patton's advance were African-American soldiers. In the Reich's racial hierarchy, these men were supposed to be incapable of discipline, incapable of modern coordination, incapable of sustaining a military miracle. And yet, they were doing exactly that. These were the men who were keeping the Third Army alive, the same army that now threatened the German border. Every mile of supply they delivered was a blow to the mythology that had built. The Reich, a mythology of superiority now crumbling under the weight of reality. One German officer, educated in the doctrines of racial science, confessed later that the intelligence reports felt like a personal betrayal. It was as if the universe had turned against us, he said in his post-war testimony. The propaganda machine in Berlin tried to hide it. They claimed the Red Ball Express was an American exaggeration, a myth created to boost morale. But on the front lines, no one could deny the truth. They saw the endless convoys, heard the endless engines, and knew they were witnessing a war fought by a civilization that had outgrown the limits of ideology. At that moment, the German army, once the model of efficiency, was starving. Its divisions consumed less than a tenth of the fuel available to a single American corps. Entire units were immobilized for lack of gasoline. Tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, stood abandoned on forest roads, their crews sent to fight as infantry. A panzer division required about 300,000 liters of fuel per day to operate. The Americans were burning 10 times that amount just to keep their trucks moving. To the German officers who measured war in scarcity, this was insanity. To the Americans, it was normal. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily for its own operations, more fuel than the entire German army on the Western Front received in a week. Yet the supplies never stopped. Every night, thousands of drivers, young, exhausted, often teenagers, rolled east across the battered roads of France. They slept 2 hours at a time, often in their trucks, and drove again before sunrise. They lived on cigarettes, black coffee, and determination. They were not heroes by the Hollywood definition. They were ordinary men performing impossible labor, and in doing so, they dismantled one of the most dangerous ideologies in human history. The irony was not lost on those who paid attention. Men who were segregated in their own army were now sustaining the advance of a force that promised freedom. They could not eat in white cafeterias back home, yet they were feeding the machine that would end tyranny in Europe. Some of them painted names on their trucks: Hitler's Nightmare, Black Thunder, Detroit Express. Each name became a symbol of defiance, not just against fascism, but against history itself. Meanwhile, in East Prussia, General Heinz Guderian received reports that made him furious. The Americans had turned supply into strategy. Every destroyed bridge was replaced in less than a day. Every blown rail line was rebuilt by dawn. Where the Germans saw obstacles, the Americans saw engineering problems to be solved. By early September, over 40 bridges had been constructed or repaired by U.S. Army engineers to maintain the Red Ball routes. The Germans, who prided themselves on their technical genius, found themselves watching an army that operated without perfection and still won. A captured German major told interrogators after the war, "They violated every rule of war we knew, and it worked. We realized that their chaos was a kind of order." That realization spread like poison through the ranks. The officers could feel the collapse not only of the front, but of faith itself. What good was the perfect plan, the flawless formation, the superior design, if it could be overwhelmed by sheer motion? By mid-September, the German High Command understood that the old doctrines were finished. Model, Rundstedt, and Klug argued endlessly over strategy, but all of them knew the truth. The Reich was fighting a civilization that had turned factories into weapons and trucks into soldiers. America had not only mobilized its army, it had mobilized its society. Every worker, every machine, every drop of oil was part of the battlefield. In contrast, Germany was starving from within. The cities were bombed into ash, rail networks shattered, fuel depots destroyed. The Reich's total war economy was collapsing under the weight of its own lies. Hitler still demanded offensives, still believed in miracles, but his generals no longer did. They watched their men retreat through mud and snow, their tanks silent, their air force grounded. And always, the sound, that low hum of engines rolling ever closer. At night in captured villages, German soldiers could hear American trucks rumbling beyond the hills. The sound carried miles across the valleys. They knew what it meant. More supplies, more ammunition, more fuel, more life for the enemy. Some described it as the most terrifying sound of the war because it meant the Americans could never stop. Even when the guns were silent, the engines never slept. Statistically, the numbers were staggering. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Its drivers covered more than 122 million ton miles. They burned 57 million gallons of gasoline. They destroyed or wore out more than 5,000 trucks, but replacements arrived faster than they could be counted. The system was so large it consumed itself and kept growing. It was as if America had discovered perpetual motion, fueled by industrial willpower. The Germans tried to replicate it. In the winter of 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, they attempted a similar logistics network using captured American vehicles. They called it Operation Greif. Within days, it failed. The fuel ran out. The trucks broke down. The drivers couldn't maintain the pace. They had tried to imitate the system without understanding it. The Red Ball Express wasn't just about trucks, it was about culture. The Americans believed in motion, the Germans believed in control. And in modern war, motion wins. When the winter came, the Red Ball Express did not stop. Temperatures dropped below freezing, roads turned to ice, and fog blinded the drivers. German doctrine declared that wheeled logistics were impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. The Americans kept driving. They chained their tires, poured alcohol in the radiators, and rolled on through snow and sleet. To the watching German officers, it looked supernatural, as if the elements themselves had betrayed them. By early 1945, it was over. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a supply route. It had become a metaphor for the century to come. It represented the victory of industry over ideology, of motion over mastery, and in that victory lay a warning the world would spend decades trying to understand. After the war, captured German generals were asked what had surprised them most about the Americans. Their answers were almost identical. Not the tanks, not the planes, the trucks, the endless ordinary trucks. One field marshal put it simply, "We prepared for everything except their ability to move." Another said, "We lost to a civilization, not to an army." Their pride was gone, but their clarity was perfect. What they had witnessed was not only the end of the Reich, but the end of an era. The last time a nation believed it could win through precision alone. The new world would belong to those who could improvise, produce, and endure. The Americans had not been perfect soldiers, but they had been tireless, and that was enough. The Red Ball Express proved that the future of warfare and of civilization itself belonged to those who could turn chaos into momentum. The story did not end in 1944. Many of the Red Ball drivers returned home and changed America itself. They became truckers, engineers, and entrepreneurs. They helped design the interstate highway system. They built the backbone of modern logistics, the invisible machinery that moves the world. Their experience in France had shown them what mobility could achieve, and they carried that lesson into peace. In a quiet irony, the world that emerged after the war still follows the rhythm of those engines. Global trade, mass production, constant motion, all are descendants of the Red Ball Express. The same energy that crushed the Reich built the modern age. It is both triumph and warning, because motion never stops. It only accelerates. And somewhere in that acceleration, we can still hear the echo of 1944, the hum of trucks moving through the night, carrying not just supplies, but the future itself. April 1945. The roads to Berlin were filled with ghosts. Tanks burned silently beside fields that had once been green. Villages no longer had names, only coordinates. The war that had begun with the promise of a 1,000-year empire was ending in dust, noise, and disbelief. For those who had fought, for the Reich, there was no glory left to cling to, only the sound of engines approaching from the west. It was not an army that was coming, it was history itself. In the shattered rooms of command bunkers, the last German officers studied maps that no longer mattered. The Red Ball Express had done its work months earlier. It had carried the power that broke them, the endless fuel of a civilization that never stopped. Every liter of gasoline, every spare tire, every repaired bridge had been a nail in the coffin of the old world. The men who once believed themselves chosen by fate were now watching the collapse of certainty. The empire built on hierarchy and obedience had been crushed by a world built on speed, production, and motion. For some, that realization came too late. In the ruins of Magdeburg, a young German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We did not lose to their weapons. We lost to their will to continue." That sentence would outlive him. He was killed 2 days later by artillery fire that had been supplied by the very trucks he had feared. But his words captured what no general report could, the psychological truth of defeat. The Americans had not only defeated the Reich militarily, they had proven that the future belonged to those who refused to stop moving, even when reason told them to. When the American troops entered Germany, they found more silence than resistance. Roads that once carried panzer divisions now carried refugees. Cities that had once echoed with speeches now whispered with hunger. But the greatest silence was in the minds of those who had believed. The ideology that promised invincibility had turned to dust. For years, they had been told that they were the chosen race, the masters of modernity. Now they faced the truth that modernity had left them behind. In interrogation rooms, German generals tried to explain their defeat. They spoke of fuel shortages, broken supply lines, the destruction of infrastructure. But when asked what truly defeated them, most gave the same answer: logistics. The Americans had mastered something that went beyond strategy. They had learned to merge human determination with mechanical motion, to turn industry into instinct. They made war into a system, said one captured officer. And once the system moved, nothing could stop it. Yet beneath that technical explanation was something more human. The Americans had fought with a faith that no calculation could measure. The drivers of the Red Ball Express had faced fatigue, fear, and discrimination, but they never stopped. Their courage was not born from ideology, but from necessity, the simple understanding that if they didn't move, others would die. That kind of determination frightened the Germans more than any weapon. It was proof that the world no longer belonged to those who commanded, but to those who endured. In post-war Europe, those who survived carried a strange mixture of shame and fascination. They had been defeated, but they had also witnessed the birth of something new. Many of them later admitted that the war had opened their eyes. The Reich had believed that strength came from purity, from order, from control. The Americans had shown that strength came from diversity, from chaos, from collective purpose. It was a truth that would reshape the entire planet in the decades to come. After the surrender, as the occupation began, German civilians watched the Americans rebuild what they had destroyed. Roads, bridges, hospitals, even schools, everything rose again, faster than they thought possible. The same trucks that had once carried death across France now carried food and medicine across Germany. The Red Ball Express had been a weapon of war, but its spirit lived on as an engine of reconstruction. For many Germans, that was the most humbling lesson of all. The same hands that had crushed them were now rebuilding their future. Time passed, and the memories of defeat became history. But for those who had lived through it, the sound of the engines never faded. They would hear a truck on a distant road and feel their chest tighten, remembering the vibration in the air, the endless hum that once signaled the approach of the inevitable. It was not hatred they felt anymore, but something closer to understanding. The Red Ball Express had not just brought the end of a war, it had brought the beginning of a new world. Today, when we look back at those years, we often see the war as a series of battles and dates. But behind every victory and defeat were choices, human choices, that changed the direction of civilization. The men who drove those trucks probably did not think of themselves as heroes. They were tired, underpaid, often unappreciated, but their endurance became the quiet victory that defined an age. They did not seek power or glory. They sought completion, to finish their route, to deliver what was needed, to keep moving no matter what. In their persistence, they represented the resilience of humanity itself. If there is one lesson to draw from the perspective of the defeated, it is this: arrogance always collapses under the weight of humility. The Reich believed it could dominate through superiority. It was destroyed by persistence. It believed in control. It was defeated by adaptability. And it believed in hierarchy. It was undone by unity. That is not just history. It is a mirror. Because every generation faces the same question. Will we repeat the blindness of those who believed themselves invincible, or will we remember that endurance and compassion are stronger than pride? When the German officers gave their final interviews after the war, their tone was neither defiant nor apologetic. It was reflective. One said, "We did not understand the world we were fighting. We thought we were fighting armies, but we were fighting civilizations." Another added, "The Americans won because they believed in tomorrow. We only believed in ourselves." Those words spoken in defeat carry more wisdom than any victory speech, because they remind us that the power of a nation lies not in what it controls, but in what it creates. And perhaps that is the legacy of the Red Ball Express. Not the miles it traveled, not the tons of supplies it carried, but the idea it represented, that progress cannot be stopped by fear, and that humanity moves forward when ordinary people refuse to give up. For the losers of that war, this realization was painful, but it also gave them hope. If a system built on hate could fall, then perhaps something better could rise in its place. As the engines of history continue to roar in our own time, in our technologies, our industries, our daily lives, we should remember what those final days taught the world. Motion without meaning leads only to exhaustion, but motion with purpose can rebuild everything. The Red Ball Express proved that even in the darkest moments, movement itself can be an act of faith. And now, as you finish this story, let it move something inside you. If this journey through the eyes of the defeated has made you reflect, if it has made you feel the human side of history, then stay with us. Click the red button below to subscribe. Like this video to help others discover these forgotten perspectives, and share your own thoughts or questions in the comments, even anonymously if you wish. Because history is not just about remembering the past, it is about understanding how we became who we are, and together we can make sure those lessons are never forgotten.